I feel like this idea of coming home was something that I wanted to invite the reader into, especially if you live in a marginalized identity, is that perhaps home is not a place or a person or a community. Home is a place that you cultivate for yourself.
Dr. Wang, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. Just for everyone listening and watching, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, like where you're from and what you do?
I am a clinical psychologist here in Houston, Texas, and I do a combination of seeing clients in therapy as well as writing. I also have a social media kind of presence where I talk about mental health within immigrant and Asian communities. So, yeah, that's kind of what I do. And I also speak for companies and organizations in terms of really understanding mental health, how it applies to marginalized communities as well.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your work as a clinical psychologist, and are there any specific experiences that put you on this path?
So I always say I was supposed to be an accountant. And so this is quite a departure from that, and I think
Yes, I
being,
would say. Absolutely.
um, yeah, so being a child of immigrants, right, there was so much of wanting to, be there for my family, pursue stable careers. So accounting business was a very stable career, so my parents thought. And so the departure into psychology was something that kind of they were unprepared for. They had no idea that it was something that was a growing interest of mine. And, I think the element for me that drew me to psychology was really wanting to be with people. I think the idea of being behind an Excel spreadsheet for the rest of my life sounded kind of like dull, soul sucking.
I can sympathize.
So I think that was the element that drew me to it, but also realizing that at the time, there were so few Asian psychologists. I really had never seen one. And so this idea that perhaps this aspect of my identity could be something that could serve our community, could highlight the issues that are unique to certain, cultures, certain backgrounds, was a really appealing one. And so that was kind of what sparked it, and the rest is history.
What made you decide to look to social media to share some of your insights?
Well, I'll be honest, I have very complex feelings about social media. And yet, at the same time, I think you're right. The profession, typically, it is very private. There's a lot of privacy, confidentiality that we work very hard to protect. And at the same time, I think the problem with mental health is that it often is siloed into academic centers, hospitals, clinics. And there are some people who are just living their lives. They're not necessarily have a diagnosable condition, but they want to improve their mental well-being. And so, in some ways, social media allows us to democratize mental health, right? It allows us to offer it freely for people.
Are there any especially meaningful interactions that you've had with your social media community that you'd like to share with us?
Sure. The thing that comes to mind is that when my social media platform was evolving, one of the most important things that I wanted to cultivate was a sense of belonging, or that people were not alone in their mental health struggles. And so when I would share themes or topics, people would start commenting in the comments section and share stories or anecdotes or just kind of like votes of confidence and affirmation in people's experiences. And I think that then cultivated a space that may not have existed previously, where people with shared backgrounds, shared experiences could realize, oh my gosh, this thing that I thought I was the only one struggling with, all these other people felt the same. And that helps to destigmatize mental health, right? It allows us to realize that that deep, dark secret that we feel shame around is actually much more common than we think. And I think the most touching parts are when people reach out and say, because of you, I started seeing a therapist for the first time. Or because of something you shared, I had that hard conversation I had been avoiding. And I think that speaks to the impact of social media if it's used with, I think, wisdom and it's used with intentionality.
So just backtracking a second here, because you had mentioned, that because of your cultural background and sort of a deficit in that space for the Asian community. I'm wondering what role perhaps your family played in your life and your career.
Oh, I think it is 100% has a strong influence in how I practice, how I think about and conceptualize mental health. You think about family being that first microcosm where you learn about the world. You learn about relationships, you learn about emotions, you learn about what is something that society accepts versus doesn't accept, right? And so that family unit is the place in which we start to realize I exist, I have boundaries, or I don't, right? As some families struggle with boundaries. So I think my family's personal story of being, my parents were first generation immigrants to the United States in the 80s, and watching their struggles, watching the barriers to communication, to the discrimination they experienced, to having to navigate a world that was not theirs for the first time in their lives. It helped inform the complexities that I think immigrant background and mental health intersect. And when I think about how that applies to my work, I have so many second, third, fourth generation Asian Americans who are struggling with language barriers with their parents, cultural divides, right, generational gaps. And so, having experienced that myself, I feel like I can speak to those experiences and also offer a sense of hope that it is possible to cross some of these bridges with the older generation, while also realizing we can build different bridges with our kids. And being a parent now, that is such a big part of what I do too.
I'm wondering, in general, just even becoming a psychologist is probably filled with challenges and overcoming those. What are some of your coping mechanisms for overcoming challenges and improving your mindset during the difficult times?
Hmm. I think being a woman, being a person of color, there are already layers of people telling you what you can and cannot do in your life. And when you add on kind of parental expectations, there could be a sense of pressure, right? Be this, do that. This is the right way. And I think it has taken me now 40 years of my life to be able to say, wow, right? I can see those pressures and I can choose a different path. And so I think when you're young, you are very susceptible to those pressures. And I was definitely one of those. But I think one of my coping mechanisms was I kind of have a more rebellious side to me. In my teenage years, I definitely conflicted with my parents because I didn't necessarily want to do what they wanted me to do. And I think in some ways, I was able to harness that into a sense of carving my own path. And so I think one of the ways that I cope is when I feel like my path is blocked, or when somebody says, no, you can't do that, you're not capable, you're not XYZ enough, it makes me angry that somebody's putting a limitation on me. And that anger is meant to fuel something more, right? I think a lot of us grow up being told anger is a bad emotion. You shouldn't feel angry. When in fact, anger is the part of you that says, I love me too. And when there's an injustice, or when someone has judged you, right, wrongly, it's to say, that's not fair. That's not right. And it pushes you, right, to think outside the box, to take a different path, to find the detour. And I think the anger and understanding how to harness it has been one of my most powerful tools.
I'm wondering specifically in the Asian community, are there any big issues or like common themes that come up when you speak to your clients, like specific to that demographic?
Hmm. I think a theme that often arises is, and it's not across the board, not every Asian American experiences this, but it is a common theme, is perhaps like a scarcity mentality. This idea that, especially if your parents were fleeing war, poverty, right, trauma, conflict in their homelands, and they come to a new country, there's always this feeling that there's not enough. We don't have enough. We don't feel stable enough, secure enough. Because a lot of our parents came with no safety net, right? My parents immigrated here as the only two people in their families to come to the United States. So there was no uncle you could call for a backup childcare. There was no backup resources or financial support. They were on their own. And so that scarcity mentality kind of develops as a protective mechanism. It's, let's kind of squirrel away our resources. Let's always be kind of on the defensive, right? Let's not take risks because they're really costly if you don't have a backup network. And so that develops, but then the second, the third, the fourth generation might still carry some of that intergenerational trauma as they live their lives. Like, I'm thankfully in a very different financial situation than my parents. And that was something that they gifted us, was they helped support us through school. They provided support when we needed it so we could get on our feet when they had very little. And so that idea of scarcity of, I can't take risks, don't step outside of the box, don't rock the boat, is not necessarily as applicable to future generations. But many of us might actually still live with those frameworks as if we are kind of still bound in those restrictions. And so I think that's one of those areas where we kind of have to say, well, maybe I do have the ability to take some risks. I can do some things outside of the box. I can challenge some of the status quo. A lot of my clients will say, there feels like there's some injustice at work, and my parents would have never said anything. They would have just put their head down and worked through it. But I actually feel like I have the ability and the influence to make some impact here. But it's scary, right? So also working through the fear that some of these situations put us in, I think that's definitely one of the bigger themes.
So you have a book, Permission to Come Home, Reclaiming Mental Health as Asian Americans. I'm wondering what the process was like for writing that, if you could share a little bit with us.
Sure. It started as like an inkling. I was writing all this information on social media, and somebody reached out and said, have you thought about putting this into a book, a tangible form that people could carry with them or to read on their own? And I knew before writing even the chapters or understanding what the chapters would be, that the title would be Permission to Come Home. And the reason was twofold. One is permission. In collectivist cultures, we are so connected to everybody else. And so there often is a sense of deference out of love, out of respect, out of honor to the people we love, to ask them for permission. Can I study this? Can I be this? Can I marry this person? Can I live my life this way? And I wanted to kind of flip that on its head and say, could we claim permission for ourselves? Could I actually give myself permission to do these things that align with the life I'm trying to build? And so every chapter is a permission to feel, permission to rage, permission to say no. And I'm trying to invite the reader into giving themselves permission to take ownership over these parts of their life, which invariably impact mental health. And then this idea of coming home. As an immigrant, as a child of immigrants, I don't feel at home in Taiwan, which is where my parents are from, even though I love the culture, I love the food, I love visiting. But I'm always too Western, too American. My Mandarin is not on point. There's always reasons to set me out from Taiwanese community. And here in the United States, I'm too foreign, too Asian, too other, right? And over pandemic, I mean, people literally would stare my family down because there was so much anti-Asian kind of sentiment. And so I feel like this idea of coming home was something that I wanted to invite the reader into, especially if you live in a marginalized identity, is that perhaps home is not a place or a person or a community. Home is a place that you cultivate for yourself. And the idea
I
of
like
home, yeah, and the idea of home feels like the safe place. And what is mental health if not feeling safe?
if you could go back in time
Hmm.
and share one message with yourself, knowing what you do now, what would it be? And how far back would you go?
Ooh, that's such a good one. I think I would go back to my teenage years when, I grew up in a predominantly, white community. I was often the only minority, if not one of a handful. And I remember at times not being proud of my Asianness or my identity or my culture. I remember at times wanting to flee from that part of myself, trying to assimilate, thinking, oh, that's what's going to be the thing that helps me belong. And I think I would tell that younger self that, in fact, the parts that you're trying to run from will be the very parts that give you the most power for what you do today.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Wang, for being on the show. And please keep doing exactly what you're doing. A lot of people need it. And I think a lot of people will benefit from having heard this little chat. So thank you so much and have a great day.
You too. Thank you so much for opening up space and having me.